The left's goal all throughout history has been equality, a flattening of the destructive social hierarchies that have plagued us for the last few thousand years. One of the oldest hierarchies is that of the state. This misinterpreted political entity has been the biggest obstacle in the way of the left, not just in its efforts to stop us directly, but also accidentally. A tale as old as time is the up-and-coming caring ruler who conquers power for himself atop the state pyramid, passing benevolent reforms before eventually becoming authoritarian. But why? Is it that he wasn't principled enough? Was he secretly evil? No. This is a case of conflating correlation with causation. The abhorrent behavior of those in power isn't the result of a few bad or corrupt people. Rather, the state conditions those who wield it to act in a certain way and meet certain standards. Just as a soldier in the military is conditioned to be a strong killer, a bureaucrat in the state is conditioned to uphold and reproduce state power. And part of reproducing state power is curtailing the rights and privileges of the people. Failing to do this will lead to the people distributing power more equally, which is in direct conflict to the state's monopoly. Rudolf Rocker gives a pretty good analogy for why the state can't be used to liberate the working class. And just as the functions of bodily organs, plants, and animals cannot be arbitrarily altered, so that, for example, one cannot at will hear with his eyes and see with his ears, so also one cannot at pleasure transform an organ of social oppression into an instrument for the liberation of the oppressed. The state can only be what it is, the defender of mass exploitation and social privileges, the creator of privileged classes and castes, and of new monopolies. So what exactly is the state, and why should we define it? Defining the state is an important aspect of this discussion, as it gives us a basis for our analysis and critique. Without clear and precise definitions of different political phenomena, we can't communicate or fix problems with our society. If there's not some sort of definition for various political concepts, then that opens the door for misinterpretations, manipulation, and oppression. An example of this being Tanky's hand-waving the term authoritarian for being meaningless, when in actuality, it is a very useful term by those wishing to critique the hierarchies which oppress them. Now obviously, the only reason you wouldn't want people to use a term like authoritarian is because you don't want them criticizing your favorite despotic regime. Tankies aren't the only one guilty of this. The state uses this tactic frequently too. By discrediting various descriptive political terms, the state in effect eliminates the working class's ability to understand what's wrong in society, making it much easier to control the types of ideas that are normalized. So if we wish to be effective and clearly communicate, then it's very important that we have precise definitions for what we're trying to talk about. That brings us back to the question, what is the state? In Kropotkin's The State, Its Historic Role, he said, it not only includes the existence of the powers situated above society, but also of a territorial concentration, as well as the concentration in the hands of a few of many functions in the life of societies. It implies some new relationships between the members of society which did not exist before the formation of the state. A whole mechanism of legislation and policing has to be developed in order to subject some classes to the domination of others. Kropotkin definitely hits the mark on a few key aspects of the state and gives a pretty clear picture of what anarchists mean when they talk about it. Now let's take a look at an excerpt from Zopaker's book, Means and Ends. The state is necessarily a centralized and hierarchical institution wielded by a political ruling class. This class possesses the authority to make laws and issue commands at a societal level that others must obey due to the threat or exercise of institutionalized force. Since the state is a centralized and hierarchical institution that rules over an extended territory, it follows that the political power of the so-called worker state could not, in reality, be wielded by the working classes as a whole. State power would, at best, be exercised by a minority of elected representatives acting in the name of the working classes. For the purposes of this video, and all of my future videos, I will define the state by using a combination of the various descriptions that these authors have given. The state is a hierarchical and centralized entity which alienates the majority of the population from the civic functions of society. Civic functions being the military, courts, legislation, etc. These functions are usurped and wielded by a minority political ruling class in their own interests and the interests of the economic ruling elite. It maintains this position through institutionalized violence and oppression, thwarting any movement antagonistic to its power. This is the core reason behind the anarchist critique of seizing state power. Socialism and communism are inherently horizontal, decentralized, and anti-authoritarian. Because of this, the state will always be at an antagonism with these movements. Therefore, any revolutionary attempting to conquer the state in the name of socialism will actually only be conquering socialism in the name of the state. The slaughter of Kronstadt is a very insightful event on the core nature of the state, and one of the most tragic. Kronstadt was a naval base for the Russian Baltic Fleet, a very important strategic location in the Russian Civil War. The people there were at the front lines against the White Army since 1917, fighting tooth and nail for a better future. Many radical sailors had criticisms of their state socialist counterparts, but they were willing to ignore these differences to secure the revolution, although Bolshevik hostility made this approach impossible. Throughout the war, Lenin and his revolutionary government enacted a policy called war communism, which basically meant that soldiers could forcefully requisition food from peasant farmers. This policy inevitably led the peasants to feeling alienated and angered, even betrayed by the Bolsheviks. They just fought to throw off the yoke of one oppressive exploitative regime, only for another one to seemingly take its place. As a result of this policy, peasant strikes broke out all over Russia, reaching its peak in 1920 to 1921. On February 26, 1921, Kronstadt sent delegates to a nearby city called Petrograd, where various workers were involved in the strikes. Their intention was to find out the reason for the strikes and possibly even coordinate with them. 2 days later, the delegates reported back. The situation was immediately clear to the sailors. They were in full sympathy with the strikes. After hearing about the harsh repression by Bolshevik authorities, the sailors met on the Petropavlovsk and approved a resolution of 15 demands. The demands made in this meeting were a reflection of the general attitude of the peasants and workers. The exploitation and domination by the authoritarian Bolshevik Party needed to end. On March 1st, the sailors held a mass meeting of 15 to 16,000 people in Anchor Square. The meeting adopted the 15 demands that the sailors had come up with. This would later be known as the Petropavlovsk Resolution. Along with this, they also decided to send another delegation to Petrograd to discuss what had happened at Kronstadt. Sadly, though, all 30 of the delegates were arrested by Bolshevik authorities. This would prompt another meeting on March 2nd, where Kronstadt would form the Provisional Revolutionary Committee, which would serve as a coordinating body for the defense of Kronstadt. Kronstadt would adopt this resolution due to the increasingly aggressive rhetoric by the Bolshevik state. This would mark the beginning of Kronstadt's autonomy from the Soviet government. On the same day, the Soviet government responded with an ultimatum. They insisted that the rebels at Kronstadt were ex-Tsarist officers funded by the French and that the rebellion needed to cease immediately. Funnily enough, Trotsky, a member of the Bolshevik Party and leading military commander, placed Tsarist officers on the island to be military specialists. And regardless of any Tsarist officers on the island, the driving factor behind Kronstadt's defiance was Bolshevik oppression and increasing centralization of power. The main rhetoric of the sailors and workers at Kronstadt reflect this. In the Petropavlovsk resolution, they stated, quote, Number 1. Immediate and new elections to the Soviets. The present Soviets no longer express the wishes of the workers and peasants. The new election should be by secret ballot and should be preceded by free electoral propaganda. Number 2. freedom of speech and of press for the workers and peasants, for the anarchists, and for the left socialist parties. Number 3. The right of assembly and freedom for trade union and peasant organizations. Number 4. The organization, at the latest on 10th of March 1921, of a conference of non-party workers, soldiers, and sailors of Petrograd, Kronstadt, and the Petrograd district. These are only some of the demands made in the Petropavlovsk resolution. Feel free to read the whole thing. A link will be in the description below. If words aren't enough to sway you, look at the actions taken by the Free Commune just days into the rebellion. They abolished the labyrinth of bureaucracy set up by the Bolsheviks, first by getting rid of the hierarchical unions, replacing them with horizontal and directly democratic workers' councils. They also tackled one of the core issues driving the strikes at the time, war communism. The radical sailors abolished the rationing system, instead distributing food equally, only giving the children and sick extra food. The direct management of workplaces by the workers themselves, along with the horizontal nature of the Free Commune, were all natural implementations of socialist ideology. Ask yourself this: what is the biggest critique of capitalism? It's the hierarchical dynamic a boss has with the worker. Marx and many others rightly pointed out that this inherent characteristic of capitalism is harmful for the working class. This dynamic isn't exclusive to capitalism, but is also a feature of the state. Unchecked, unaccountable, in positions which directly determine your well-being, this is a recipe for domination and exploitation, regardless of who wields that position. Kronstadt was resisting what they saw as a return to this harmful social relation. They understood that changing an exploitative and oppressive power structure's name doesn't change its function. And so, like every party embedded within the state, Bolshevik aggression towards Kronstadt and its demands came out of a place of self-preservation. The radical sailors of Kronstadt had questioned the credibility of the Bolsheviks as representatives of the working class. The Soviet state could not allow such a sentiment to grow, as their entire regime was built off of such credibility. If the veil was lifted that they were, in fact, just another privileged minority ruling class, their power would be threatened or even destroyed. And so, by the logic of the state and its internal requirements, Kronstadt had to be crushed. In preparation for a potential siege, the rebels seized the island fortifications to no resistance. They elected the PRC with the chairman Stepan Petrenko. This body would raise around 11,000 troops, as well as organize the distribution of guns on the island. The rebels knew that they were isolated, low on supplies, and freezing, but they had hoped that popular support would force the Soviet state to concede to their demands. However, this hope seemed less likely after the Soviets murdered 45 of their delegates in cold blood. The Soviets had no intention to negotiate or end the rebellion peacefully. Earlier on March 5th, they ignored anarchist Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman's request to mediate the situation. Trotsky had this to say about peace: only the seizure of Kronstadt will put an end to the political crisis in Petrograd. And so the Soviet military rose around 10,000 men in the local area to seize Kronstadt. Many of the soldiers on the Soviet side knew or even had familial ties with the sailors. So morale for the first assault was extremely low. In the early hours of March 8th, the shelling from two northern towns finally stopped. Bolshevik officer Tukhachevsky orders his 10,000 units to attack from the north and south during an extreme snowstorm. Cheka machine gunners were stationed at the back to shoot any troops who decided to turn around. While crossing over the icy canal, large explosions cracked the ice, leading to a mass of Bolshevik troops drowning to death. Many refused to advance. Some even went over to the rebels, with only a small number of troops actually reaching the island. The first attack was a tremendous failure. The attackers were forced to retreat. Even after the spectacular failure of the first assault, The Soviet elite still talked of an easy victory against the rebelling sailors. I'm sure the hundreds of soldiers who died appreciate the comments from the elites who sent them there to be floating corpses in the water. Only minor skirmishes happened in the days following, with no real ground being made. Parallel to this siege, though, many strikes were happening, which the Soviet state attempted to quickly contain. They knew they had to do something fast, and so they pulled a card from their sleeve. During the 10th Party Congress, the Bolsheviks announced an end to war communism. This was their ace to try and end peasant strikes and increase army morale, a valuable move which would tragically seal the fate of the rebel commune, as the population were content with the concessions given by the Soviet government. The rebels were on their own. With a new morale boost and a fresh supply of 50,000 troops without sympathetic ties to Kronstadt, the Soviets tipped the balance to their favor. New, more experienced leadership would also support the final assault. The artillery in the previous days had been relentless. The Sevastopol and Petropavlovsk were both hit directly with artillery, killing and injuring numerous soldiers. But finally, in the early afternoon, just like last time, it stopped. Tukhachevsky organized an attack from the north, east, and south. Outnumbering them 10-3, the Bolsheviks began their final attack. Most of the soldiers were concentrated in the south and east, with only a few cadets in the north. The rebels anticipated them this time, though, as they had attacked in the same pattern before. The attackers and defenders both took heavy casualties, but the Bolsheviks finally managed to gain ground and took 2 fortresses. By sunrise the next day, the bloodbath began. They began to push into the city itself, machine guns pelting the attackers, grenades blew up sailors, and hundreds lay dead. Bullets flew everywhere, from every rooftop and crevice. The attackers called it a veritable hell. Half of the Bolsheviks' 79th Infantry Brigade died, including 15 Congress delegates. Inch by inch, the fighting continued. The rebels attempted multiple counteroffensives which nearly pushed the Soviets out of the city, but further reinforcements prevented the breakthrough. By late evening, the northern cadets made it through the gates and linked up with the southern group. By midnight, all major pockets of resistance were crushed by government forces. The state had won. By the end of the battle, anywhere from 1,000 to 10,000 lay dead, depending on who you trust. This event would have lasting effects on the Soviet Union and the labor movement as a whole. Kronstadt showed us that the state can never be wielded in any interest other than its own. Lenin, Trotsky, and all the rest aren't especially evil or opportunists. They were products of their social structure. The state corrupted them, not the other way around. For Emma Goldman, the Soviet Union's actions at Kronstadt was the final straw. She became disillusioned with the Bolsheviks and their regime. This was not just a big wake-up call for her, but for many radicals at the time who thought leftist unity was a tactically good idea. They learned from their mistakes, and we need to as well. The slaughter of Kronstadt emphasized the inherent dynamics the state power structure has with the working class. As Rudolf Rocker said, just as in religion God is everything and man nothing, so in politics the state is everything and man nothing. It is a structure which sits above society. It is the creator of authority, the machine which crushes the will and natural development of human beings. We must part with the notion that the state can be used for any progress. The state has never given us an inch, and never will. Authority can't build a better future for us. That can only be done by the people themselves.
И поэтому знаю, со мной ничего не случится.